Hey y'all, I'm Mickey Gusay. All right, we've reached the episode where we're going to actually merge our code into the default branch and trigger our deployment. So here is the scenario. The scenario is we've already created the pull request. We had a workflow that ran that did a build and a test on the pull request and everything passed. So the next step is to merge the code to the default branch. And when we merge the code to the default branch, we're going to build the code again, test the code again, and then we're going to take the artifacts from that build and test, and we're going to deploy them to Azure. And we're going to deploy them to Azure to both. It's a web app, so we're going to deploy it to an Azure App Service, and we're going to deploy it to a dev slot on the Azure App Service, a staging slot on the Azure App Service, and then the deployment to the production slot will pause and wait for an approval. So we're going to learn how to do all of that today. Now, there's some things around this that I'm probably going to save for another video, which is the fact that I'm using OIDC to connect to Azure, because this is going to be a decently long video as it is. But let's get started. So let's switch over. As usual, here we are in my demo repository, github.com/devops/elvis/my GitHub Actions presentation. And we want to we have our pull request from the last couple of videos, and it is now ready to merge. So based off the scenario that I specified earlier, we need a workflow that's going to trigger when this merges so it can build the code, test the code, and deploy the code. So if we come out here to the code tab and we go to the .github folder and we go to the workflows folder, I have a workflow that will do this, which is the push default and deploy workflow. So here we go. So this workflow has a name, push default and deploy. It triggers on a push to the main branch. Again, just like with the PR, I have multiple switches I can put on this to control when it runs. Then I have this section here called permissions. So by default, when you execute your GitHub work item, it's going to have either read access, or your GitHub workflow, it's going to have either read access to the repository or read and write access to the repository. However, there are a lot of different permissions you can give the GitHub token, which is what the workflow is running as. That's the user the workflow is running as. And in order for me to use OIDC, which is Object ID Connect, in order for me to use OIDC to connect to Azure, I have to give this workflow some extra permissions. So specifically, I have to give it ID token and contents. Now, I knew I had to do that because the documentation told me so. So we specify the required permissions, and then we get down to the jobs. Now, for this workflow, I have 4 jobs declared. The first job is called build and test. It runs on Ubuntu latest, and it's going to look really familiar if you watched my pull request video from about 2 weeks ago, because it builds the code, it sets up .NET Core, it restores the dependencies. Sorry, it doesn't build the code. It checks out the code, sets up .NET Core, restores the dependencies. Then it builds the code, runs the tests, creates a test summary, puts the test results information into the job summary of the workflow. Then it creates the artifacts that we need to deploy this website, and it uploads those artifacts to this workflow. So this code right here that we, in the build and test step, is the exact same code to the T of what we had over in our pull request from a couple of videos ago. So wouldn't it be nice if there was a way we could declare this code once and then use it in multiple places? Well, there is. And what we're going to see in a future video is we're going to replace this code with a custom action that does all these functions so that we can use that custom action in both workflows. After the build runs, then I have a job called deploy to dev. Now deploy to dev runs on Ubuntu latest, and it needs the build job to complete successfully. So that's, we saw needs in, I think, the second video of this series, which is it needs the build job to complete successfully before it can run. But you'll also notice we're targeting an environment. So what is an environment? An environment is a GitHub construct. Think of it as kind of like an object. And we're going to go look at where this environment is declared and created here in just a moment. But I'm targeting an environment named dev, and I can optionally provide a URL for this environment. And if I do provide a URL for this environment, then this URL will show up in the workflow run, and I can actually click it to go to that particular environment. So you target an environment, and a job targets an environment. And when you target an environment, you use the keyword environment, and then you specify the name of the environment and optionally the URL. Okay, so what is an environment? I mean, how do I actually declare an environment, right? Well, what you do is in the repository, you go to settings, and you go to environments. And you can see here, I have 3 environments that I've created: a dev environment, a prod environment, and a staging environment. So what does targeting an environment get you? Well, if we look at the dev environment, you can have required reviewers. And in fact, we have that in the production environment. And what required reviewers gets you is the ability to say, these people, this person or someone from this team has to approve this job before it can run. So when the job gets queued up, it's just going to wait until someone approves it or rejects it. So this is what's going to allow us to require the approval on our production job. You can also specify a job has to wait a certain amount of time before it runs. And using GitHub Apps, you can create your own custom deployment rules. For example, maybe you only want to allow deployments during production work items or during business work hours. So you could create a job that doesn't allow, or create a deployment gate that doesn't allow the job to run during production work hours. So you can have deployment protection rules. You can control what branches are allowed to deploy to this environment, meaning maybe I have to come from a branch that has a branch protection rule on it, or I have to only allow selected branches to be able to run against this environment. And then finally, you can have secrets and variables that are only allowed to jobs that target this environment. So this means we now have 3 levels that we can install secrets and variables in: at the organization level, at the repository level, or here at the environment level. So if we go back to our workflow, we're targeting the dev environment, and then we have some steps going on here. First step is we're using the actions download artifact to download the artifacts we uploaded in the previous step. So remember here in the previous step, we uploaded some artifacts. So now we're using the download artifact to download those same artifacts, which is the zip file full of files that I need to deploy my web app. Then I added just a little test step. This was me trying to make sure that things were being deployed where I thought they were being deployed. Then I need to log into Azure. So I'm going to log into Azure using the Azure login action. Now, if you go look at the Azure login action, so if we grab this value and we go to github.com/Azure/login, we can see the information about this action. We can see there's a lot of different ways that you could use this. You can use OpenID Connect. You can use service principals, system assigned managed identities. Lots of different information on how to use this Azure login. Now we're specifically using OIDC. So what I've done in Azure, and I'll show you in another video how I did this, is I've created a claim over in Azure that expects that if I have a workflow that's running in this repository, in this organization that's targeting a dev environment, it has access to a certain resource group in Azure, which then allows me to do my deployment. And the nice thing about OIDC, by declaring it that way, is all I need is a client ID, the tenant ID, and the subscription ID. I don't need a secret. So I put all these in secrets because you should always be extra secure with your Azure information. So putting in a secret makes sense, but I don't have to have a secret. I could have put them in variables if I really wanted to, because you still, since I'm using OIDC and I haven't created a secret value for you, you still can't really do that much with just those values. So we're going to log into Azure. And then finally, we're going to use another action from the Azure team called Azure Web Apps Deploy. We're going to deploy to this web app, which I've declared in a variable. Now, where do I declare variables? Well, if we go back up to my repository, and we go to settings, under actions, I have a secrets tab where I declared all my Azure secrets that I was using. And then I have variables, which is where I can declare my variables that I want to use. For example, my web app name, which is my web app, please work. I access a secret by saying $curly brace secrets dot secret name, and secrets and variables should always be all uppercase with underscores for spaces. And I access a variable by saying $curly brace vars dot web app name curly brace. So using this action, I give it an app name, I give it a slot name, and the package, in this case, those artifacts that I downloaded earlier, I want to now deploy those artifacts off to that web app. And that's my deployment to dev. If we look at my deployment to staging, which we also want to happen at the same time as we deploy to dev, it looks very similar. Runs on Ubuntu latest, needs build and test to complete successfully. It's a different environment, but I'm still downloading the same artifacts. I'm still logging into Azure the same way, and I'm still doing the same deploy. I'm just changing the slot name to a different slot name. And if I look at my deployment to prod, again, looks very similar to the other two. However, for our deployment to prod, we want both dev and staging to have completed successfully. We are targeting the prod environment, which we'll go look at in a moment. But then I'm still doing the same things I was doing before, right? I am downloading the artifacts. I am logging into Azure, and I am deploying my Azure web app to this particular slot. So wouldn't it be nice if I could come up with a way to just create all this deployment code once and then call it from these different jobs? Basically, implementing code reuse. Well, I can. And in a future video, we're going to show you how to use reusable workflows to do just that. So there you have it. There is the deployment workflow that we're going to run when we merge to main. Now, one of the other things I wanted to show you is if we look at my environments and we go to the prod environment, for this environment, you'll notice that I am requiring a review before the prod deployment can run. So let's go make sure that I haven't disabled this action, which I have. So let's enable it. So we're going to enable this action to run. And if we go to our pull request, and we say merge pull request, That's good. It's merged it. So we're going to delete our branch because we don't need our branch anymore. And if we go back over to Actions, we're going to see that our push default and deploy job has started. Our workflow has started. Now, check it out. We get a different kind of visualization. We're seeing a visualization of the jobs, kind of like we did in part 2, where we see the build and test job. Then we're going to deploy to dev and staging, and then we're going to deploy to prod. So what we're going to do is, this won't take very long, so we're actually going to sit here and let these run. All the tests should pass. It should upload the artifacts for us. And then once that happens, the deployment to dev and the deployment to staging should take place. So there you go. The build is passed. So now we're deploying to dev and deploying to staging. Hosted runner is picking it up. So for dev, we're downloading the artifacts that we uploaded earlier. There's my little step to prove to myself the files are there. And now we're logging into Azure. Remember, we're logging into Azure using OIDC. And then now that we've gotten logged into Azure, we're going to deploy for this job to that dev slot. And you can see we even have a little boxes showing us for each step in the job where we are. All right. So check it out. We have deployed to dev, we have deployed to staging, and we are now in a wait state. We can see here that we're currently in a wait state because we are waiting for someone to review and approve or reject this deployment. Now you'll notice that we got those web links that we provided. So let's actually go look at this code. So this is the dev one, and you'll notice that on the dev one, it says YouTube rocks. So our change was deployed. If I change this to be the prod one, then you'll notice that YouTube rocks is not currently in prod. So our code got deployed to dev. If we go to staging, I'm sure we'll see the same thing that has been deployed to staging as well. Which it has. YouTube rocks. But it has not been deployed to prod yet because we're waiting on the review to happen. So I would have gotten a notification that I need to do this review. So I'm going to click Review Deployment. I'm going to say I'm reviewing for the prod environment, and I'm going to say, it looks good to me, ship it. And in fact, we'll even put a little, nope, no emoji, so that's fine. We'll just say, looks good to me, ship it. I'm going to approve this to run. Because I'm approving it, it's now going to allow the job to run. So this will take just a moment for it to run here. And then we should be able to go out to the production website and see that we have added YouTube rocks to the top. So we'll give this just a moment to finish running. Boom, it is finished running. And if we click the link, let's do a refresh on this page. There it is. We're at the production website and YouTube rocks. So we've done it. We have used GitHub Actions to build our code and test our code to enforce our processes on the pull request, as well as to then deploy our code off to multiple environments in Azure using GitHub Actions and also using OIDC to talk to Azure. Now, the next step that I think we're going to go to is, and I might change my mind, but if I don't change my mind, let's flip back over here. So if I don't change my mind, the next step is going to be, we want to take that code that is the same in the pull request and in the deploy, and create a custom action to use that code. And then in fact, we might actually even, so over here, I got a lamp. It's got one of those fancy light bulbs in it. And so the fancy light bulb allows you to change the color. So what we might do is even add some code to change the color of the light bulb. So if the build passes or fails, we change the color of the light bulb. So we'll see about doing that as well. But I think that's going to be the next couple of videos, is we're going to look at custom actions. Actually, it'll be the next 3 or 4, because we're going to look at custom actions, and then I'll take a detour and show you the different ways to build custom actions. And then we're also going to look at reusable workflows and how both of those can be used to reuse code in your GitHub Actions. All right, thanks for watching.